Mr. Speaker, we hear so much on our television from some of our statewide elected officials, the idea that indoctrination is happening in our classrooms. And now we want to invite this further potential to tell me that a person of faith, particularly in a culture like ours in Oklahoma, does not have an intent to proselytize, when we all know that the intent of the faithful is most often in our Oklahoma culture to proselytize. There is entirely the possibility that outside entities, out-of-state entities, out-of-country entities can pay people to employ them to volunteer, quote unquote, as chaplains in our public schools, even as some of these entities claim, in order to infiltrate a system. It sounds like indoctrination to me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I will try not to take my entire time, but I understand, having seen this bill in committee, I understand the author's intent. However, I believe that the intent versus the reality will not match up. I grew up in rural Oklahoma, like so many in this room. I grew up with chaplains in my church. I grew up with teachers who were professed people of faith. I grew up around this. In our state, it is more a part of our culture than this body would like to admit. Adding more bodies adds more risk, adding more potential for liability issues. Now we're going to have the opportunity for local school boards to determine what religious practices can be potentially taught, discussed, or even what religious beliefs can be taught, discussed, or approached to our students. I grew up in a very small town. I grew up with rural, conservative people. The people who taught me in my public school were rural, they were conservative. They were, by and large, professed Christians in their faith and their actions. I am not offended by that. However, if we do want to talk about indoctrination, I'm happy to discuss some stories of some things that were said, and they weren't from the left. They were very much from the conservative Christian perspective. And to pretend that this isn't a part of our culture, that we don't already push this on our children. Just hearing other bills that we've heard this week, we know this to be fact, that we are trying to create protected classes of adults who may have the option to further indoctrinate children who are wards of the state. We may have the option to further indoctrinate children only if it meets a certain criteria that fits the culture of our state. Mr. Speaker, this bill, Senate Bill 36, opens up massive liability issues on our public schools. And I challenge any school board to sit down and determine how they will avoid these issues of liability. This bill allows for unfettered and unsupervised access to children without the written consent of parents. Sure, the child or the parent can opt out if they know about it, if they understand the full process. But we haven't included any kind of a system, of a framework for our public schools and our school boards to go by. So we can also end up with a slew of different rules, different faiths, different ideas being presented into our public schools, which so many times in this building I'm told is wrong. Mr. Speaker, I'm asking for a no vote because I understand that it is my job as a parent to teach my kids our religious and moral interpretations of this life. It is my personal responsibility It is not on the public school teacher to teach my children anything about religion, anything about our moral and personal beliefs. It is also not on our public school districts to do that. This opens that door. It also opens the door for local school boards to have to control and determine what a chaplain can say. Mr. Speaker, this is an incomplete bill. It has unintended consequences for miles, and I ask for a no vote. Thank you, and I don't know that if I can yield the rest of my time, I will to Representative Waldron. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative, for taking questions today. We had a good conversation in committee and then another one since, and I appreciate that. I do have a question regarding a concern. Part of the language allows a school to employ or to accept a volunteer. Currently, a school district is liable for the behavior if it is criminal or otherwise not appropriate for any volunteer that the school accepts. My concern and my question here is, will it be possible, and I believe it will be possible, for an outside entity outside of the school, whether that be a church, a school, maybe a corporation or a nonprofit, or even an individual, to pay people to volunteer in school districts as chaplains? And if that's the case, where they are effectively employed, even as on a contract basis, by an outside entity to go into a school as a volunteer, will the school be held liable in that case? If I'm sorry, Mr. Yeah, you know.
Well, I think I know where you're going with that, but if a school district decides to do this, then yes, they would ultimately be responsible for what this person is or is not doing. And that is why I personally feel it's very important to give that flexibility to that school board to clearly define what it is that they're wanting out of this person for this role, whether it's a volunteer or it's being hired, or, you know, in the scenario that you put out, somebody is paying them, basically subsidizing them to come in and do this at no cost to the school district. But in any of those situations, the school district gets to define exactly what it is that they want that person to do, and there are some things listed out in the bill as reasons for dismissal. It's not and it even clearly says this isn't the only reasons, but these are some of the things that would apply to this context of being a chaplain. You know, Oklahoma is a right-to-work state. I mean, you can essentially let somebody go for any reason. So I think as far as all of that goes, you know, there's more than enough protections in the legislation and in our current laws.
For a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for your response, Representative, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to kind of follow that up with, I think part of my concern, and if you wouldn't mind speaking to it, or would you mind speaking to it, is that if we have an outside entity who is training and paying, is it not in the best interest of our state for our public schools to be absolved of that? And since schools can already accept volunteers, I don't believe there's anything in statute that would prevent a school from already inviting someone onto their campus who happens to be a chaplain as a volunteer. So since we don't have that in statute, are we not potentially adding liability to the school district and potential lawsuits from that regard? And would you mind speaking to that concern, please?
Sure. I don't personally agree with the path that you're tracking on, but with this in place, it gives that school district the ability to clearly outline, and something that would be vetted before the people that live in that school district, give them an opportunity to weigh in on it as well. So to me, I think that this gives a lot more open and clarifying process to allow for this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, thanks for continuing to take questions today. Will it be possible for the local school board to promulgate rules that would effectively create religious speech boundaries for these chaplains? Are we putting our school boards in a position where they are going to now need to locally legislate what a chaplain can and can't say, can and can't talk about on school property?
Well, the school board absolutely could do that, but with chaplains, they are specifically trained to not proselytize. So it's not like they're going in and trying to convert people to their particular belief. They are going in there and, they're just like in the Army or in the police setting. When somebody wants to talk to them, they're trained to, basically read and react and just help them get through whatever it is that they're getting through. They're not trying to win them over to Christ or anything like that. Just help them get through whatever the situation is or crisis.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate your response, Mr. Chairman. I understand that, to speak to that question, to your response real quick, you did add the sensitivity to religious pluralism. However, I'm not certain I agree that every chaplain is trained not to proselytize. So in that regard, how do we ensure that that's the case? And are parents and students going to have the capacity now to sue a school district over First Amendment violations if a school chaplain violates these perceived lines of proselytization, particularly if we don't have in state statute really that training that ensures that they've been trained prior to becoming the chaplain for a school against proselytization?
I don't share your concern on that. I've talked to a lot of people that are involved in training chaplains, that are chaplains, and they are very sensitive to that, and they know that that's not what their role is. And beyond that, we've got it in the bill that no child will have to meet with a chaplain, and we also added in parental opt-out. If you as a parent don't want your child to talk to this person, you're free to opt out of that. So
54 aye, 37 nay.
Having received a majority vote of those elected to and constituting the House, I declare the bill to have passed. Mr. Floor Leader.